which in fact are economically unsustainable.
Why does the government force the wind and solar renewable options? Why are they tied to it? Why are they pressing for it?
Because it is good, morally superior, and green. And so this is where the value judgment is coming in. And this is where, of all the crazy things, the Environmental Protection Agency can become so politicized, even in its science on carbon dioxide. You know, there was a very strong internal report from a longtime employee of the EPA saying, just a minute, guys, we should reanalyze the science under this thing. And that was suppressed in the so-called open, transparent process that we have. It's in my book. The author of that study is named. This is a true fact that his boss said, don't you talk about this anymore, because this is the way it's going to go. And so the EPA's decision on carbon dioxide being basically a toxic pollutant, an air pollutant, is an absolute disgrace with regard to scientific truth, when CO2 is actually the most important food for life on Earth. That is a fact. It cannot be denied. And it is a fact that CO2 is a greenhouse gas, in that, along with a number of other compounds that are in the air, it increases the effectiveness of solar energy at warming our Earth's lower atmosphere. That is a fact. But it is not a fact that temperature and carbon dioxide have been in some kind of lockstep throughout the history of life on Earth. As a matter of fact, there are periods when they seem to be somewhat correlated, but there are other periods when CO2 was like 5 or 10 times higher than it is today, and there was an ice age occurred. That was like 450 million years ago or so. But it happened. And therefore, at that period, despite the fact that CO2 levels were extremely high, it did not warm the Earth. It actually went into an ice age.
I think that information and that frame of reference is not registered in the public mind, which is very important that it isn't, and very important that it should be. This is where we get confused.
Yeah, it's denied. And that's what the hockey stick was all about. Even though the hockey stick only went back 1,000 years, which is like nothing. It's like 2 seconds. Even though it only went back that far, no one in daily life thinks that 1,000 years is a short time. For most people, 1,000 years is like, oh my God, 1,000 years, that's like eternity. And so the hockey stick, starting 1,000 years ago, purported to show that the climate was steady and cooler than it has been in the last 50 years, and shows this giant uptick at the end, hence the hockey stick. Basically, that whole exercise was in order to deny that there was a medieval warm period and that there was a little ice age. The medieval warm period peaked about 1,000 years ago. Grapes were being grown in Scotland. The Vikings colonized Greenland and Newfoundland. Not many people in this world know that there was a Norse colony in northern Newfoundland 1,000 years ago. The site is still there. It's a national park. The pits where the houses were built are there. We know it was Norse because of artifacts that were found there. Those people were frozen out when the medieval warming period ended and the little ice age came on for 300 years or so. The River Thames last froze over in 1814 and had been freezing over on a fairly regular basis for a few hundred years prior to that. There's paintings of people skating on the Thames, for example. So we know that this is true. It's not just anecdotal. It's a fact. And yet it stopped around 1800, and the climate began to warm again. And in fact, today, the world's climate is about 1 degree and maybe a half in that area warmer than it was during the little ice age. But what people don't realize is that today's world is only 2 or 3 degrees Celsius warmer than it was at the height of the last glaciation, when in fact, before the ice age came on, the world was much warmer than it is today. 4, 5, 6 degrees, even 10 degrees Celsius warmer on average than it is today. There was no ice on the poles. The ice on Antarctica started building up about 25 million years ago, whereas for 100 million years before that, Antarctica was forested. And so were the Arctic islands of Canada forested up until even more recently. It wasn't really until 2.5 million years ago that the present ice age, and I say the present ice age, this is what people don't understand. We are still in the Pleistocene, the ice age. That's why there's so much ice on the poles and why the northern and southern hemisphere are so bloody cold in the winter is because the Earth is still in an ice age. And being not in an ice age would mean that there would not be all this ice on the poles and that it would be reasonable to live in northern Canada, which it is not at the present time. That's why Canadians are all huddled along the 49th parallel, because it's the only place where it's halfway livable, and it's only halfway livable. I say to audiences, and this is what one of my best laughs is, how come there's 300 million people in the United States and only 30 million people in Canada, which is actually larger geographically? And there's one word that explains that: cold. It is too cold in Canada. And then I say, sometimes I think that's why the Yanks let us have it, me being a Canadian. And there's some sense to that, in fact, because the vast majority of Canada is basically inhospitable, and the only good thing about it is there's resources there, and that's why there's people living in Fort McMurray at the oil sands, and why people are living up in the Northwest Territories at the big diamond mines. Other than the Inuit and the Dene, and the very few people who managed about 30,000 years ago to figure out how to live in those harsh Arctic conditions by utilizing marine mammals and having dogs to keep the polar bears away and to pull them around on sleds. They did manage to figure out how to live there, but they, like the penguins, are very few and far between. There's very few species and very few humans that can live in those terribly cold climates. Most of the people are in the warm places, like Sao Paulo, where there's, between Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, there's 35 million people living within a 100-mile radius in Brazil. That's where people like to be, is where it's warm. And, we have managed to colonize the colder climates because we have fire, clothing, and shelter. But otherwise, we are a tropical species. And that's another thing people don't understand. We are a tropical species, us humans. We came from the equator in Africa and spread out because we developed technology and the ability to survive in colder climates. But take off our clothes and take fire away and take shelter away, and we have to be in an equatorial climate even to survive through one day.
So the issue with nuclear anything, my take on it is that there's a great many people that don't trust the stewards and the Commission for Nuclear Energy to secure those plants and to secure the contents of them. Now, I know that in the book you explained nuclear waste very thoroughly, and you explained that some of the nuclear waste is pebbles. It's not just liquid. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about this. But I do want to say legitimately that it seems as if what happened in Japan and what happened obviously in Chernobyl is all of our greatest fears. But one of the things you brought up in your book is that there has been a lot of nuclear testing that Russia's done, that China has done, and the United States has participated in that have hurt the environment badly. In fact, we're still living in it. And how much radiation was released into the air and into the environment from that. But I know that if there was a way, or if the way was secured to guarantee the protection of these plants, really solidify that, I don't think there would be as much resistance. But I think there's good reason to have tremendous fear about it. I think it's rational to have prudence about it. I don't think it's off balance for people to want to call nuclear energy and the providers and the stewards of it to account for huge transparency and an ability to protect at all costs. And so I want you to explain to us why you say nuclear waste is fuel of the future, the distinction between fusion and fission. And one of the things you said is that 100 years of a nuclear energy product equals 10,000 years of energy production.